Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, and thank you, Front Page and the organizers for inviting me and bringing me closer to issues that are dear to my heart, and that is talking about policy in Lebanon. Well, I'll try to focus, since previous speakers since this morning, and we heard from the Prime Minister and the Minister of Energy talk about their view of where the policy framework is going. I'm going to try and focus in my presentation on looking at the macro, giving you a macroeconomist view of how do we assess energy policy in countries, and looking at their, mainly at their economic impact, and then try to see how did Lebanon fare over the past years, and where did we go wrong? Why are we at the current stage where we are? Really always focusing on the nexus between energy policy and macroeconomic policy. And then third, end by trying to project ourselves into the future and look ahead at some of the key macroeconomic policies, particularly fiscal, that we will need, I think, to adopt in order to avoid what was labeled in the morning the resource curse. I think it's a very common practice to define energy policy objective as this triangle of trying to achieve through the energy policy in a country the often competing objective of securing energy security, access at affordable prices, environmental sustainability, in that our energy does not undermine our environment, but also being able to ensure that our energy policy is supportive for economic growth and sustainable development. This is really the framework through which the International Energy Agency defines the energy policy. But also, this is really the triangle through which worldwide, in the assessment of energy policies across countries, this is how worldwide we assess energy policy. And I took one example of a benchmark, international benchmark used by the World Economic Forum, which takes the Energy Architecture Performance Index and benchmarks all countries around the world. 126 countries entered through this exercise, and I think they are in the 5th years of doing that, in trying to look at these 3 dimensions of energy policy. That is economic growth and development, environmental sustainability, and energy access and security, by looking at a range of indicators. Without going into the details, obviously, we don't have time, it is very interesting to see that the Middle East and North Africa region, despite being one of the regions that is the richest in terms of energy resources and reserves of oil and gas, actually fares the worst in terms of performance of energy policy or assessment of energy policy. And on all accounts, not only does the region lag behind, but in what concerns us as Lebanese, unfortunately, Lebanon falls at the bottom of the scale. We are ranked number 125 out of 126 countries, and our score of policies looks the worst exactly in the area of economic growth and development. What does that mean? And here I try to compare Lebanon to other oil-importing countries in the region, to which obviously we need to benchmark ourselves because we are all subject to the same condition. We are price takers, and our energy policies are meant to deal with the same. Lebanon fares worst in terms of its impact of energy policy on its economy. You could tell me, we know this, and I'm sure you know about these things. But let me just remind you to put things in perspective. I think it is very clear from all the enterprise surveys that Lebanon has done, the World Bank has done in Lebanon, that issues of infrastructure are the major bottlenecks to growth. But in particular, most recently, and the most recent surveys has showed that actually Lebanon ranks fourth worst in the world in terms of quality of electricity supply. And that obviously explains why we are why the impact on growth is so negative, given the strong correlation between actually quality of energy policies and availability and affordability, and also economic growth worldwide. And there's a whole host of literature that explains that. But not only is our energy policy a main hindrance to growth, it's also a main drag on our weaker external position. We have one of the largest current account deficits in the world, and import of fuel actually even outweighs the exports of Lebanese products that we have been exporting over the past years. Obviously, that translates into our bigger problem that is now the subject of heated debate, that it's also the sector is the biggest drag on our public finances. Needless to remind you that in the 2014, when average oil price was around 100, the transfer to the electricity of du Liban constituted more than half of our deficit. And according to the World Bank, between 2008 and 2014, 40% of our additional debt accumulation resulted actually from the deficit of our electricity sector. This is a huge by any standards. I mean, and I think even if we are to think the burden that we are putting on our future generation, that could be really something that is unfortunately very hard to reverse unless immediate policies are taken to tackle these policies. These problems. And we know what these problems are. I'm not going to go to talk about them. The demand that outweighs production capacity, the sector's inefficiency and misgovernance, the below-cost recovery tariffs, the huge burden of subsidies. These problems are still the same despite all the policies, laws, and regulations that have been adopted since 2002. And if we are, I'm not here to be pessimistic, but I'm saying we need to learn from our mistakes, particularly if we now, the focus, as we heard from the previous speaker, is to focus on a new area of energy that is even potentially more controversial if misgoverned or mismanaged, similarly to the electricity sector. And for me, there are three areas that where we did massive mistake in Lebanon. The first one, obviously, is the poor governance of the sector and the fact of the long delayed, for example, and non-existent regulator of the electricity sector, which Law 462 actually provides for, is a good example. The ad hoc decisions and revisions to the law, which wanted to give give the ministries or the Council of Ministers potential rights to provide concessions in an ad hoc manner, is also another example of the sector. The other more important mistake that we've made, and for me as an economist is probably extremely unorthodox, is the fact that we never anchored our energy policy in a broader macroeconomic and fiscal policy. We have never tried to understand and to put to make fiscal discipline and put a fiscal constraint to the management of our power sector, and therefore try to address the issues of tariffs or building safety nets to provide for the lowest strata of the population as we proceed with tariff increases. They have never been associated with their broader fiscal, macro, and social policies. But last but not least, I think the issue of paying little attention to the strategic environment, and what I mean by strategic environment, what's happening in international capital markets and the geopolitics that affects the commodities, and in that particular area, oil, has also not allowed us to design the appropriate policies. And particularly, again, as an economist, I have in mind potentially trying to, through our analysis, potentially put a hedging program against volatility and fluctuation of oil prices, like many emerging markets did. So I think as we move ahead in terms of thinking about a new source of potential energy that could down the road, it is essential for us to think about addressing these problems. Why is it? Because as we heard in this morning, I mean, the hydrocarbon sector has potentially a lot of macroeconomic benefit. I'm not going to go through them, whether it is from a growth perspective as we proceed with the different phases of the cycle, the fiscal impact in terms of reduction in the subsidy bill, or in terms of removing some of the fiscal, relieving some of the fiscal space available to other more growth and poverty-reducing spending, whether in the social or infrastructure sector, but also the impact of the balance of payment in terms of the reduction of the energy import bill. All these are potential benefits of the hydrocarbon sector. But we also know that there are a lot of risks associated with natural resource discoveries. The fact that we could become vulnerable to boom and bust cycle and the volatility of oil and gas prices. The fact that that our inability to manage revenues properly or continue on inefficient spending and the rent distribution in an environment of poor governance. But also many of the countries, Russia is a very good example, have gone through painful Dutch disease problems that were basically exports or mismanagement of the spending of these hydrocarbon resources led to real effective appreciation of the exchange rate and have hurt very productive and competitive sectors of the economy and therefore the livelihood of a lot of people. So there's a whole lot of risks associated with hydrocarbon discovery, and I think the question for us is how do we avoid this paradox of plenty, and how do we transit from, do we avoid being a rich resource country but with poor and deteriorating political development outcome, as we have seen in many of the countries. So again, I go back to these three lessons of the past that we should have learned from mismanagement of our energy sector, to say that in order for us to proceed, we really need to focus on the governance of the sector, as Dr. Htait said. But I would have liked Dr. Htait to say, but also the minister this morning and the prime minister maybe has hinted at it in the morning, is that we really need to anchor our macro fiscal policy, and maybe Minister Pharaon mentioned it, in a medium-term fiscal plan. And that is essential because we really need strong fiscal institutions that allow us to say, okay, how are we managing our spendings and our revenues over the next 6 years, and how does this sector basically impact our other macro fiscal? But also the morning has really confirmed to us the importance of looking at the strategic environment today. All the talks about the huge geopolitical risks that are about us, the big debate about whether the gas market is actually going to be much more challenging and competitive because it's in a dynamic state of flux and changes, requires from us not to sit and just look at the processes, but always keep in mind and have a view and a continuous assessment of what is happening in the strategic environment, in the geopolitics, where do we position ourselves. And this is essential for us in order to be able to have a gas sector that is able to compete in a much more competitive and difficult landscape. I am not going to go on, but I'm just going to, again, because I want to focus on some of the key suggestions for moving ahead from a macro fiscal point of view, I think I would go for two areas that I think are important as we try to integrate the management of the emerging petroleum sector into our broader macroeconomic policies. I think, first of all, we really need to put fiscal institutions and policies back to work. And I cannot but congratulate ourselves that finally we have a new budget, which proves that we could be in the right direction. Whether it's the right content or not, we can discuss it. But I think the whole idea of bringing back the budget as a main policy tool and pursuing reforms that are here to create the fiscal space needed for doing the right investments in order by the public sector to attract private investment, that is necessary. And for that, we really need to reform our fiscal and create the fiscal space for that. We also need to put back the fiscal framework in place because we have a very high level of debt. And as we embark on large investments, investments in the sector, we really need to attract financing at the most favorable term, and that requires, again, a stable macro framework. We also need to develop, as I mentioned, the medium term, potentially do scenario analysis with where we see our gas prices going, after, of course, deciding on the critical choice of whether we should use the gas domestically or export. All these scenarios will need to be assessed within this medium-term fiscal framework. But also, over the long term, we will need to think of how we are going to use these buffers as we start to create the fiscal space and as some surpluses are created. For us to do so in a more transparent and accountable way, many countries have used basically rule-based fiscal policies. And I think the IMF at some point had suggested this to the Lebanese authorities as they are thinking about the future fiscal framework of the country. And these are really mainly based on the principle that the hydrocarbon wealth should be treated as an asset and not necessarily as an income to be spent. And that we really need to de-link spending from the fluctuation in prices and quantities produced. And this is essential, and some tools to do so would be either to try to apply fiscal rules in the budgetary framework, enshrine rules for the stabilization and saving funds as these become, as we start developing the sovereign wealth fund or the stabilization fund that is provided for by the law, or even developing fiscal responsibilities laws that will govern the management of the sector and the use of these resources. These are just some suggestions, and I hope that as we move towards debating how we want to shape our fiscal policies to accompany the sector, we really have a much more open debate. And the reason why, and just to end, I would like to bring a very interesting quote from professor and prominent economist at Harvard, Jeffrey Frankel, who said that we need to set up regimes ex ante which are more likely to deliver the right results ex post in a world inhabited by humans and not by angels. I think just listening to this and trying to put it in the Lebanese context, we all can just we can just appreciate the importance of building strong institutions, accountable framework, and the right sequences of transparent and contestable policies. Thank you very much.